On June 8th, in the year 793, at the monastery on the island of Lindisfarne, it's in northern England, just off the coast, a small island where a very important and significant monastery was situated. But on June 8th, 793, boats appeared on shore, and men got out of those boats and came and ransacked the church and slaughtered the priests and the monks that were there. The quote from one that was there: "Heathen men came and miserably destroyed God's church on Lindisfarne with plunder and slaughter. The church was spattered with the blood of the priests of God, despoiled of all its ornaments." Those men were, of course, Norsemen or Vikings. 793 was one of their early raids, one that shocked England as to the threat, in part because of the desecration of the church. But by 850, Vikings were a permanent part of England. They were staying there over winter. Their armies remained. And by 870, the eastern half of the island had been conquered. Now, that certainly was an unlooked for, unexpected day of woe. The thing on the top is a carving that was made there of the Vikings invading. It's called the Doomsday Stone. But the other part of the story that is interesting is this, and that is the Lindisfarne Gospels. This is one of the most ornate and beautiful hand-done Bible manuscripts ever made because of its art. You see there on the left-hand side. This was completed around 715 AD, so before the attack, and yet somehow it survived. And later on in the 10th century, an English monk put along the Latin text, the main part is Latin, but you can see there's a little handwriting underneath it, right? That is Old English. It is our earliest translation that survives of the Bible into English, this case, the Gospels. This is a Bible of Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the Gospels. And so amazingly, that beautiful portion of the Bible survived this day of woe, this day of terror. And I thought that one is an interesting place to start. We're going to take a look over this week and the next 2 weeks at the book of Joel. And next week's message has some very quotable, very encouraging lines in it. But we can't get to those in chapter 2 until we've looked at chapter 1 and the start of chapter 2 yet, because that's not where Joel starts. That's where he's heading, but where he starts is in a very difficult place. And we're going to take a look at quite a bit of text, but it's all one thought, one idea that we're going to look at this morning. And so let's start with Joel chapter 1, verse 1. It says, "The word of the Lord that came to Joel, son of Pethuel." And just to get the niceties out of way, there are 12 Joels in the Old Testament that are mentioned, 12 different guys by the name of Joel, but it doesn't appear that this one is any one of them. It doesn't fit with the timetable. We don't know anything about this Joel. We don't know anything about his father, so we don't know anything about this guy. And the authorities, the experts, can't agree on when this was written. Some people think it was as early as the 9th century BC, before both the northern tribes of Israel were destroyed and the southern tribes were taken into captivity. Some people think it predates that. Others think it came after that. It's hard to say. There are parts of the book that make it feel like it could be either one. So we don't really know much about the specifics, and it's interesting because Joel's not going to give us very many specifics. He doesn't tell us about any people that we could say, oh, this was during his life, or about specific places or anything like that. Notice that he says the word of the Lord that came to him. And this is how the prophets begin. They are saying that this is a message that they received directly from God through maybe a vision or a dream. And so they are relating what God had to say. So even though these are Joel's words, Joel is saying, this is what God told me to say. Gives it a lot of weight and made sure, hopefully, that the people would listen to it. So what is the message? There's quite a bit of text, so bear with me as I read the sections, and then we'll comment a little bit on each section. It says, "Hear this, you elders. Listen, all who live in the land. Has anything like this ever happened in your days or in the days of your ancestors? Tell it to your children. Let your children tell it to their children and their children to the next generation. What the locust swarm has left, the great locusts have eaten. What the great locusts have left, the young locusts have eaten. What the young locusts have left, other locusts have eaten." Fascinatingly, there are multiple words for locusts in languages that exist here in the Middle East because they have these locust swarms. We have occasionally some annoying bugs, stink bugs or something that are just everywhere, or ladybugs in your house, and you're like, oh, this is so annoying. But it's not like a swarm of billions and billions of locusts. And that evidently is what was happening in Joel's day. That doesn't narrow it down, of course, because these things happened in the Middle East and still do, these swarms of locusts. The people were besieged by them. This was an epic, what most people would say, natural disaster. It's the kind of thing that happens over there. Notice he's talking to people that live in the land. And when they're talking about the land, they mean the promised land. The land that was promised to Abraham. Call it Judea, call it Israel, call it Palestine. It's that sacred land that was to be given to his descendants. The people of Israel at this point in history are living in the land. And that is the land that Moses is talking about when he says, if you do these things, you will be blessed in the land. If you do those things, you will be cursed in the land. And all of the law of Moses pertains to them living in that land and what will happen depending on how they are doing. Notice he says, this is the kind of thing that you need to tell your children. All right? The things that they didn't witness. Like 9/11. Is one of those things that we will be telling future generations because they weren't here for it. They don't know what it was like. My mother's generation talked about the day Kennedy was assassinated. My grandmother's generation about Pearl Harbor or the Great Depression. These moments in history where you say, these are the kinds of things that we need to always remember, that we need to learn a lesson from, that we need to share with our children and our grandchildren so they're not forgotten. So what is the message, right? Something terrible was happened, but what is the message? So as we continue, he'll develop that for us. Notice this, he says, wake up, you drunkards, and weep. Wail, all you drinkers of wine. Wail because of the new wine, for it has been snatched from your lips. A nation has invaded my land, a mighty army without number. It has the teeth of a lion, the fangs of a lioness. It has laid waste my vines and ruined my fig trees. It has stripped off the bark and thrown it away, leaving their branches white. The initial reaction that we often have to something, whether it's a natural disaster or a human act of evil, our initial reaction is typically shock. How could this happen? How did it happen? How could we not have been more prepared? How come we didn't do this, or how come we didn't do that? That's our initial reaction, right? We are shocked by it. And Joel says, you all need to wake up. You need to wail because this is bad. Notice the imagery. He's comparing this locust infestation to an army because like an invading army, it is ravaging the land and destroying everything, stripping the trees bare. Nothing is left behind. So much so that this next section tells us how bad it was. This is something for us to focus on. It says, mourn like a virgin in sackcloth, grieving for the betrothed of her youth. Grain offerings and drink offerings are cut off from the house of the Lord. The priests are in mourning, those who minister before the Lord. That's a fascinating thing to talk about there. First off, the imagery. He says it's like a young woman who was betrothed. She's engaged, and her would-be groom dies before they can be married. how tragic that is, how sad that is, because they're young people. They got their whole lives ahead of them. They've got this plan. They're in love. They're happy. And then he's taken away somehow. And that can be certainly very difficult to deal with. And so he says, that's the kind of situation we have. It's so bad that the grain offerings and the drink offerings are not happening. You might be thinking, grain offerings and drink offerings, what's he talking about? What's that? Two different places in Leviticus, chapter 2, the first two verses talk about these grain offerings. These are the only thing that were placed upon the altar that was not animal, that was not lamb or cattle, but was actually something without blood in it, was the grain, and the grain was burned up on the offering, or on the altar. And the second one was wine, and the wine was poured out. It's called a libation. You pour it out before the altar. These were part of the daily sacrifices every day at the tabernacle and later the temple of Solomon. Every day near the entrance to the temple, they had two sacrifices that had to be made, one in the morning and one at night. And at each one, a lamb was sacrificed. And at each one, flour was brought and burnt up. And at each one, wine was poured out. And so twice a day, every day, for every generation, that was supposed to happen. And Joel is saying this time of woe, this disaster is so bad that we can't even do that because the priests have nothing to offer. There is no grain left. There is no grapes for wine. They have no ability to do this sacrifice. And so he says they're in mourning because what can they do? That's their job. Their job is to administer these sacrifices, to do this on behalf of the people before the Lord day after day after day. And yet that ritual has to be abandoned. So imagine that equivalent, a disaster in our land, in our town, in our region that is so bad that church has to close, that we can't come here because we just can't function. That kind of thing has happened during the height of the Black Death and other times when war is ravaging the land or floods, and you simply literally cannot hold services. You cannot gather the people together because it's not safe or the place has been destroyed or something like that. And so that's the place they find themselves in. Desperate, destitute, and just in shock. Unfortunately, Joel has more explanation and further discussion of this. He says, the fields are ruined, the ground is dried up, the grain is destroyed, the new wine is dried up, the olive oil fails. Despair, you farmers, wail, you vine growers, grieve for the wheat and the barley, because the harvest of the field is destroyed, the vine is dried up, the fig tree is withered, the pomegranate, the palm, and the apple tree, all the trees of the field are dried up. Surely the people's joy is withered away. Disaster doesn't normally hit everybody, right? Economic disaster. If there is a blight or something that kills, there's one going on right now. They're estimating that half of the world's pigs might die because of the flu that's spreading right now amongst the swine herds. But it's not getting the cattle, it's not getting the chickens, it's not affecting the wheat or the corn or the grapes. In this case, the locusts, they eat everything. They kill everything. And so he is saying that it's not just the growers of figs or grapes or wheat. Everybody is suffering. Everybody is in trouble. Surely the people's joy is withered away. Imagine a time when the normal joys that you would experience in life, the things that you would celebrate, right? Bridal showers and baby showers and birthdays and anniversaries and Christmas and all of the time, and the 4th of July, the kinds of things that we celebrate and have fun, when those are set aside. Because it's just not the right time. How can you celebrate at a time like this? I don't know how many people celebrated birthdays on 9/12/2001. How many people were in the mood to have a cake, unless it's a little child and they don't know what's going on, but adults probably were like, let's just cancel. How many people had a big party on 12/8/41? On a day of unexpected woe, on a day of misery, it's not the time to celebrate. It's not the time for a party. Joel says, this is where we are as a people. Our joy is withered away. So what do we do? And here's where he begins to talk about what the people need to do. Next week, we'll look at the full response. It says, put on sackcloth, you priests, and mourn. Wail, you who minister before the altar. Come spend the night in sackcloth, you who minister before my God. For the grain offerings and drink offerings are withheld from the house of your God. Declare a holy fast, call a sacred assembly, summon the elders, all who live in the land, to the house of the Lord your God, and cry out to the Lord. So he says that same thing again about the grain offerings and the wine offerings. They can't be offered. The priests might as well just mourn. There's nothing they can do. But what he wants them to do is cry out to the Lord for help, to focus everyone's attention upon the tragedy, to bring everybody in the land together, to assemble before God and show their dependence upon God. When things are disastrous, when we're in a time of woe, whether it's our lives individually or our town or our nation or whatever the group is that is suffering, Joel is saying one of the things we need to do is assemble before the Lord. Come together, show God that we remain dependent upon Him, that we continue to trust and cry out to God. Because God is the one with whom the ultimate power rests. Whether it is a natural disaster or something that is the judgment of God, the power still rests with God. The ability to help us through it still rests with God. There may or may not be a solution to the problem. There may or may not be a way past the current woe. But this is the correct place for the people of God to be no matter what. Whether we will be delivered or not, whether there is an answer to the prayer or not, it is still the right thing for the people of God to gather together and cry out to the Lord. Joel says, alas for that day, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come like destruction from the Almighty. Now, he's talking about a specific disaster that happened in his day. But much of what Joel is writing about, later generations looked at that and said he's also talking about something bigger than himself. He's also talking about a day that will come that will be unlike any other day, that will be woe unlike something that has never happened before. And so we will consider that as we go. He's going to return to that idea in a minute. He says, has not the food been cut off before our very eyes, joy and gladness from the house of our God? Once again, reiterating those same woes, those same sorrows, the inability to go into the house of the Lord and find joy. This one I had to make small to fit. The seeds are shriveled beneath the clods, the storehouses are in ruins, the granaries have been broken down, for the grain is dried up. How the cattle moan, the herds mill about because they have no pasture. Even the flocks of sheep are suffering. To you, Lord, I call, for fire has devoured the pastures in the wilderness, and flames have burned up all the trees of the field. Even the wild animals pant for you, and streams of water have dried up, and fire has devoured the pastures in the wilderness. Not only the farmers are hurting, but the shepherds too, because the locusts eat the grass as well, and then the livestock starve to death, and they can't save them. He also talks about fire and drought. Imagine being in this place. There's no supermarket to go for food. You are in danger of starving to death. Your family might die. You may not make it to next year. So, one more time, the focus on what we ought to do. Blow the trumpet in Zion, sound the alarm on my holy hill. Let all who live in the land tremble, for the day of the Lord is coming. It is close at hand, a day of darkness and gloom, a day of clouds and blackness. Like dawn spreading across the mountains, a large and mighty army comes, such as never was in ancient times, nor ever will be in ages to come. Joel says, warn the people, let them know that the day is coming. It's interesting to try to figure out exactly Joel's understanding here, because he's talking about a woe that is already upon them, and yet he says the day of the Lord is at hand, it is near, it is coming. So I think what Joel is doing is taking this opportunity when the people are down and when they are fearful and when they are open because they are paying attention. And he's saying to them, pay attention because this day is not the worst day. That's not a message people want to hear, right? That's not exactly what you're hoping for. The worst day that you can imagine, a day that you will tell your grandchildren about, and the prophet says to you, yeah, but it's going to be worse. There's a day coming that'll be worse than this day. And that reminds me that we tend to look at the things that happen in our lives as if they're unique. As if the disaster that we lived through, the thing that we heard about, the thing that happened in our lives is the worst one ever. But you open up a history book and you read back a little ways and you realize, no, this has happened before. And it might have been worse then. I can show you examples. That's one of the things, unfortunately, you learn the more you study history, is that there's no limit to the number of woes. The famines, the hurricanes, the wars, the diseases. There are times that have been worse than our times, whatever our times are. But Joel says there will be a day that comes that will set all of them to shame. And on that day, God's wrath will be revealed. On that day, few will survive. Next week, he'll tell us about what we ought to do given that knowledge and information. But it's important for us to remember that no matter how bad it might be now, or tomorrow, or next year, that this is not the worst of it. That it would be far worse to live on the day of the coming of the wrath of God. Before them fire devours, behind them a flame blazes. Before them the land is like the Garden of Eden, behind them a desert waste. Nothing escapes them. They have the appearance of horses, they gallop along like cavalry, with a noise like that of chariots. They leap over the mountaintops like a crackling fire consuming stubble, like a mighty army drawn up for battle. Joel describing that swarm of locusts and saying on one side it looks like the Garden of Eden, on the other side it's a desert. They're like a fire sweeping through. People out in California know about that. It looks green and lovely one day, and when the fire goes through, it's just ash. He says it's like an army moving through. There were people living here before, and now everything is dead. At the sight of them, nations are in anguish. Every face turns pale. They charge like warriors. They scale walls like soldiers. They all march in line, not swerving from their course. They do not jostle each other. Each marches straight ahead. They plunge through defenses without breaking ranks. They rush upon the city. They run along the wall. They climb into the houses. Like thieves, they enter through the windows. Before them the earth shakes, the heavens tremble. The sun and moon are darkened, and the stars no longer shine. No matter what era we live in, no matter what defenses we create, no matter what precautions we take, there will always be woe that overtakes humanity. There will always be things which we cannot properly prepare for. We think, we know more about weather disasters, we're prepared. We know better about this and that. And yet they come. And yet the times of trial and tribulation come. You see, in whatever era we live in, we cannot compare to that which is held in the hands of the judge of the living and the dead. And Joel is telling them that day will come. And as bad as this day is, it is but a foreshadow of that. He ends with this: the Lord thunders at the head of his army. His forces are beyond number, and mighty is the army that obeys his command. The day of the Lord is great. It is dreadful. Who can endure it? As much as we depend upon and focus on God as our loving Father. And who doesn't want to talk about God, the Father who loves us? I want to. I love talking about God, the Father who loves us, who forgives, who heals, who reconciles. That is our focus week after week. We talk about that. We also need to remind ourselves and not forget that God is also the righteous judge who reserves the right to execute his wrath upon rebellious humanity. Just because God is the loving Father does not mean that God is not the righteous judge. And sometimes the church has strayed away and only remembered one aspect and not the other, only spoken about one and not the other. But it is our job to bring you the whole counsel of God, as the phrase goes, to tell you everything that the Word of God says. And as beautiful as 1 Corinthians 13 was when we talked about love some months ago, Joel's reminder is also part of life. The part that we do not want to think about, but the part that will perhaps one day come. And so Joel says, who can endure it? The answer is none. No man can stand before the wrath of God. No man can endure it. No man can overcome it. And so we are left with this question. This is the introduction that Joel is giving us. And next week we will try to answer this question. Can the day of the Lord's wrath be prevented? And if it cannot be prevented, how can any man survive it? How does one avoid that day? He's going to tell us how next time. But before we deal with that, we need to remind ourselves of this. And we have Thanksgiving coming up in a couple of weeks and Advent after that, our times of celebration, our times of joy. But we need to remind ourselves that a time of woe also exists. So 3 things I want us to remember as we ponder this first part of the prophet Joel. Number 1, this is not new. This is not unique to us. Whatever happens in our lives or in the life of our nation is not a unique woe. Our ancestors dealt with similar things, and our descendants will deal with similar things. Secondly, at times even the corporate worship of the people of God can be disrupted by woe. Imagine that. I don't know what it would take for us to be able to say that we just can't come. How can we come here and worship? I know in February one of those days might come where there's 1.5 feet of snow that fell last night and nobody can get here, but that's not this kind of thing. But how bad would an infestation have to be? How bad an outbreak? How bad civil unrest? How bad a natural disaster that we would say we just can't come? Imagine that day. And then lastly, the response that Joel offers us. He'll tell us what we need to say to the Lord and how we should call upon the Lord next week. But this is where we must start, with an attitude and a willingness and a heart that says, what do I need to do now? Call upon the Lord.